Admiral Tyreth stood motionless in the observation room, staring at the small human child. Engrossed in the holographic controls, the child's fingers danced across the interface with a speed that defied logic. It wasn't a game as most species would recognize it. This was something else. This was an intricate simulation of space battle, an experience that was far too complex for someone so young, yet the child made it seem effortless and natural. Tyreth's eyes narrowed as he studied every detail. The simulation played out on a large screen in front of the child, who sat in a high-backed chair, completely focused, his movements sharp, quick, deliberate, but still casual, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The Zorathian Empire was a dominant force in the galaxy. No one questioned their power or their technological superiority. They were older, more experienced, and vastly more advanced than any other species they had conquered or allied with, and yet here was a human child manipulating a starship in ways that felt so intuitive, as if the child were born for this task, as if it was something natural as breathing. The Admiral felt an unsettling unease begin to settle within him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Humans were primitive creatures. Their minds lacked the deep complexity and structure of the Zorathian psyche. How could they possibly engage in something this sophisticated? How could one of them have such mastery over a simulation that even the most battle-hardened veterans of the Empire would hesitate to attempt? The child shifted in his seat, flicking his wrists slightly, sending the simulation ship into a tight, evasive maneuver as another enemy ship closed in for a direct hit. The movement was so fluid, so precise, that Tyreth almost forgot he was watching a child in a chair rather than an experienced fleet commander in the middle of an actual battle. For a fleeting moment, the Admiral found himself captivated by the simulation, the way the child anticipated every move of the enemy fleet and countered it with startling speed. The artificial intelligence of the simulation was no slouch. It adapted quickly, it evolved with each encounter. But this child, this human child, outsmarted it at every turn. The ship veered left, then right. It spun on its axis, dodging enemy fire and returning it with pinpoint accuracy. Tyreth's mind raced. Was this a trick? Was there some hidden agenda behind the child's skill? Was it possible the simulation had been modified somehow to give the child an unfair advantage? Or was it that the human child had simply outgrown the limitations of his species? Was it possible that something in their evolution had enabled them to develop such profound strategic and tactical insight at such a young age? The Admiral knew his species were natural strategists, trained from birth to think many moves ahead, to analyze every possible outcome. Yet even the Zorathians had never been able to mimic the unpredictable ingenuity that humans displayed. Without warning, Alex's starship lurched forward into an unorthodox attack position, catching an enemy ship off guard as it attempted to regroup. Tyreth's eyes widened as the child scored a direct hit on the unsuspecting target. The Admiral's breath caught for a moment. He leaned forward, pressing his hands against the cool glass of the observation room, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just witnessed. He had to know more. He had to understand how a child could possess such an edge. As Alex continued to play, unaware of his audience in the observation room, Tyreth couldn't shake the feeling that humanity was hiding something far more dangerous beneath their facade, something more than just the antics of a child playing a game. Over the next several days, Admiral Tyreth couldn't bring himself to look away from the child. Each time he observed Alex, he became more intrigued. At first, the Admiral believed it was a fluke, a one-off anomaly that would explain the child's sudden brilliance. But as he watched Alex play again and again, something became undeniable. The child was doing something that no other species, no other mind, could replicate. The tactics Alex employed weren't just clever. They were novel, creative, unpredictable, qualities that were as rare as they were dangerous. Tyreth had seen countless simulations in his time, watched brilliant tacticians map out strategy and execute flawless maneuvers. But never had he seen a mind so naturally attuned to the ebb and flow of battle. Every move Alex made seemed to be guided by instinct. He didn't follow patterns or standard protocols like other players. Instead, the child would choose unpredictable tactics, strategies that bent the rules of the simulation and rewrote them in real time. One moment, Alex would seem to throw caution to the wind, charging headlong into enemy fire, only to twist the ship at the last second, dodging the attack and putting himself in the perfect position to counterattack. It was as if the game itself responded to his intentions, like the child had an uncanny ability to predict the future of the simulation before it unfolded. Cyreth's curiosity grew into something more, something almost obsessive. There was no logical explanation for it. He had reviewed the child's past simulations, examined his game sessions with the sharpness of a seasoned military strategist. The child's decisions were not random, nor were they lucky. They were calculated with a sense of timing that defied reason, as though Alex were manipulating the laws of probability itself. The Admiral couldn't help but wonder if this was a trick. Had the simulation been altered to provide Alex with an advantage? Perhaps the AI was somehow rigged, designed to make the child appear more competent than he truly was. Cyreth even requested his officers to conduct a full audit of the game's programming, but the results were inconclusive. The simulation was flawless, completely untouched by external influence. And still, Alex continued to excel, time after time. On the 5th day of observation, Cyreth made an uncharacteristic decision. He would test the hypothesis himself. He had studied Alex's movements and strategies with a soldier's discipline. And now he wanted to see if the child's brilliance could translate into something real. The Admiral entered a restricted area of the station and accessed the game's controls. If he could simulate the exact conditions Alex had faced, perhaps he could replicate the child's tactical genius. Cyreth loaded a complex simulation involving a fleet of enemy ships attacking a defenseless station. He programmed the parameters exactly as Alex had faced them before. The enemy's numbers, the station's limited defenses, the complex interstellar variables. Then he took control of the simulation, maneuvering his own fleet just as Alex had done, attempting to match the child's decisions. It took only a few minutes for Cyreth to realize he had made a grave mistake. His first move was too slow, his next too predictable. The enemy fleet tore through his defenses with precision, and soon, Cyreth's forces were in disarray. His heart raced as he desperately attempted to salvage the situation, but it was clear he was failing. He quickly halted the simulation, a deep frustration washing over him. No amount of military training, no amount of tactical knowledge could match the seemingly innate brilliance that Alex displayed. Cyreth couldn't deny it any longer. The child was not just playing a game. He was demonstrating something extraordinary, something far beyond any simple simulation. Admiral Cyreth stood still, the weight of his failure heavy on his shoulders as the simulation fizzled out. He stared at the screen, processing what had just happened. A few minutes ago, he had been certain that, with his superior intellect and vast experience, he could replicate the child's movements, outsmart the simulation, and prove that Alex's success was simply a fluke. Instead, he had been bested, humiliated by a series of moves that had been both too unpredictable and too precise to follow. He ran his hands through his silvery hair in frustration. How could a child, one so young, so inexperienced, be capable of such brilliance? Cyreth had seen the might of the Zorethian fleet, their advanced technology and military tactics that had crushed countless opponents. Yet here was a human child, effortlessly outplaying him in a simulation that should have been second nature to someone with his intellect. It defied all logic, all reason, and that more than anything, made it terrifying. Cyreth returned to his observation room, his thoughts racing. Alex was still there, still playing, still winning. The child's fingers never slowed, never hesitated as the holographic stars and enemies swirled around him. Every movement was deliberate, every decision executed with an uncanny grace. It wasn't just tactical, it was something more, something deeper. The more Cyreth watched, the more certain he became that Alex wasn't just reacting to the game. He was orchestrating it. The child wasn't simply responding to the simulation's challenges. He was thinking beyond them, anticipating the next moves before they even happened. It was as though Alex had a connection to the very core of the simulation, as if he understood its structure so deeply that he could bend it to his will. The Admiral's mind reeled. Could it be that humanity, in its primitive state, had developed some kind of latent ability to think in ways that no other species had ever conceived? Was it possible that they could outmaneuver even the most advanced AIs and fleets with their instincts alone? Cyreth clenched his fists, a sudden surge of realization hitting him. Perhaps Alex's gameplay was more than a product of chance or luck. Perhaps the child was unconsciously harnessing something unique about humanity, a quality the Zorathians had long overlooked. The adaptability of humans, their boundless creativity, their capacity for thinking on the fly. Maybe these traits weren't weaknesses, as Cyreth had once believed. They might very well be their greatest strengths. The Admiral's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden alert from the station's command center. He turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. The station was receiving a signal from an approaching fleet. Enemy vessels, large and powerful, moving fast, and with hostile intent. They weren't scheduled for a diplomatic visit. Cyreth's instincts took over immediately. He snapped to attention, his mind shifting from the unsettling puzzle of Alex's genius to the looming threat outside the station. This wasn't the time for distractions. His forces would need to respond swiftly, decisively. But even as he began to issue orders, his thoughts drifted back to the child. Could the same unpredictability that Alex displayed in the simulation extend into a real-world battle? Could the strategies the child had come up with be applied to the chaos of actual combat? And if so, how much more effective could humanity be in warfare than any species had ever anticipated? Cyreth's gut twisted with a mix of curiosity and dread. If the humans had this much potential in a game, how dangerous would they be in an actual war? He quickly ordered his fleet to prepare for a full defense. Yet even as he did, a quiet voice in the back of his mind asked, what if humanity wasn't just an ally waiting to be discovered? What if they were the wild card the galaxy had never seen coming? The distant rumble of the enemy fleet's engines echoed through the command center, a sound that set Cyreth's pulse racing. The approaching ships weren't the usual diplomatic vessels or exploratory fleets that the Zorathian Empire was accustomed to. These ships were military-grade, heavily armed, and dangerously fast. The unknown enemy made no attempt to communicate, and the Admiral's instincts screamed that this was no coincidence. This was an ambush. Cyreth's mind shifted into overdrive, processing the available data. The enemy fleet was moving fast, faster than anticipated, and their approach seemed designed to catch the station off guard. A quick glance at the station's sensors confirmed his suspicions. The enemy had already bypassed most of the early warning systems. The situation was dire. In the span of a few heartbeats, Cyreth's tactical mind had begun to formulate a defense. He immediately deployed his fleet, calling for all available ships to position themselves at strategic points around the station. But even as his officers scrambled to follow orders, a troubling thought gnawed at him. The enemy had somehow anticipated every move the Zorathian fleet had made. That's when it hit him, the uncanny similarities to Alex's gameplay. Cyreth's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. The attack pattern of the enemy fleet was almost identical to the strategies Alex had used in the Starship simulator. The moves were bold, unpredictable, and appeared to defy traditional logic. There was no hesitation to gamble on untested strategies. It was the same spirit that Alex displayed in his games, only this time it wasn't a game. It was real. Cyreth's thoughts raced. Could the human child have somehow seen this coming? Was there some connection between Alex's gaming skills and the unexpected movements of this enemy fleet? If the child could think so creatively in a game, what would happen if that same ingenuity extended into warfare? The Admiral stood tall in the center of the command room, eyes fixed on the battle unfolding on the large holoscreens around him. His fleet was already engaged, and the first signs of chaos were setting in. The enemy was everywhere, flanking, cutting off escape routes, and outmaneuvering the Zorethian ships. It was as if the enemy knew exactly where to strike, how to exploit every weakness in the Zorethian defense. Kyreth ordered his flagship into a defensive posture, but he was already beginning to feel the weight of uncertainty. The Zorethian fleet had always relied on superior firepower and calculated tactics, but these new enemies weren't playing by the same rules. They were unpredictable, creative, and most disturbingly, they seemed to anticipate the Zorethians' next moves. His mind snapped back to Alex. Could it be that the child's unconventional tactics were more than just a fluke? Could the humans, perhaps without even realizing it, be capable of a kind of warfare that defied the traditional strategies of older, more established empires like his own? Edwith couldn't afford to ignore this any longer. If the humans had mastered this kind of unpredictable thinking, it could alter the entire course of galactic conflict. But could this one child, this single human, have unlocked something that no one had ever fully understood about his species? Kyreth turned to his officers, his voice calm but urgent. "Adapt to their tactics," he commanded. "If we cannot match them, we must outthink them. Use their unpredictability against them." But even as he spoke the words, he knew there was more at stake here than just this battle. If humanity could think like this, if their creativity could be harnessed, then the entire galaxy might be on the verge of a profound shift. He couldn't shake the feeling that the child, Alex, was somehow at the center of it all, an unknowing architect of a new era in warfare. And in that moment, the Admiral realized something that filled him with both awe and dread. Humanity had the potential to become the greatest force the galaxy had ever seen. The battle outside grew fiercer by the minute. The enemy fleet moved with relentless precision, cutting through Zorethian defenses, as if they had anticipated every countermeasure. Kyreth watched the chaotic scenes unfold across the holographic map. His ships were beginning to suffer significant losses. The enemy was using a combination of aggressive feints, rapid repositioning, and unpredictable strikes that were difficult to counter. For every defensive move his fleet made, the attackers adapted, finding new angles of assault. Kyreth's mind raced. There was no time to waste, no room for hesitation. His instincts screamed that something was fundamentally different about this attack, something beyond the capabilities of normal military strategy. He couldn't help but feel as if the very tactics the enemy was employing mirrored the same brilliance he had witnessed in Alex's gameplay. The child's wild, unpredictable moves, the ability to read and manipulate the simulation's flow as if understanding its very fabric. Now he was seeing it played out in real combat. A shiver ran down the Admiral's spine as his gaze snapped to the center of the battle. The enemy ships darted in and out of his fleet's reach, exploiting weaknesses that were too small to notice, too fleeting to catch. It was as though they knew exactly where to strike, when to strike, and how to avoid being hit. This wasn't the work of a random force. This was someone, something, at work behind it, pulling the strings. He couldn't deny it any longer. He had seen this before. The unpredictability, the strange genius behind every decision. It was just like Alex's gameplay. A new realization dawned upon him. What if Alex's tactics weren't just a product of the simulation? What if the child's mind wasn't just reacting to what was happening around him? What if in some way, humanity had the ability to see past the surface, to understand systems and chaos in ways that Kyreth's own species could not? "Admiral," his communications officer called urgently, "the enemy is advancing on the station's core. They've already disabled our outer defenses. We need to deploy more ships or risk losing the entire station." Kyreth's heart skipped a beat. The station, the heart of their operations, was in jeopardy. And yet, as his mind began to spin with options, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting an opponent who was far more intelligent than he'd ever anticipated. Their enemies didn't just want to destroy the station. They were trying to outsmart them, outmaneuver them, just as Alex had done in the simulator. In the midst of this chaos, Kyreth realized there was only one way to turn the tide. He needed to think like Alex. The child had played the game by rejecting the usual strategies, by following his instincts and thinking outside the box. Now, it was Tyreth's turn to do the same. If the enemy was going to use the same unpredictable tactics, then perhaps there was a way to trap them in their own game. Reconfigure our fleet formation. Position our ships in ways that don't make sense. Create gaps. Let them think they can exploit them. When they do, we'll trap them in a crossfire they didn't anticipate. His officers exchanged uncertain looks, but they didn't argue. They were desperate too. The Admiral knew that this move would be risky, but it was the only option left. They had to be as unpredictable as the enemy, as spontaneous as Alex in his game. Tyreth's fingers flew across the console as he watched his fleet reposition in real time. The strategy was daring, unconventional, but it was their only hope. As the enemy closed in on the vulnerable-looking gaps in their defenses, Tyreth could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The moments stretched out like an eternity. The enemy ships moved toward the trap. They were so focused on exploiting the weakness, they didn't see the ambush coming. At the last possible second, the Zorathian fleet snapped into place, weapons blazing from all sides. The enemy ships, caught off guard, struggled to regroup as they were hit from unexpected angles. Tyreth's gamble had paid off. The enemy fleet was suddenly in disarray, their carefully crafted strategy unraveling before them. For a brief moment, Tyreth allowed himself to feel a rush of victory. They were winning. The tide had turned. But even as the battle continued to rage, Tyreth couldn't shake the deeper realization. The tactics that had turned the battle in their favor were the same ones he had witnessed from Alex. The child's mind, filled with wild creativity and raw unpredictability, had unlocked a new kind of warfare. Tyreth couldn't deny it any longer. Humans weren't just another species. They were something entirely new, something that could shape the future of the galaxy. And they were only just beginning to realize their potential. As the last of the enemy ships were neutralized and the station's defenses were restored, Admiral Tyreth took a slow breath, allowing the tension in his body to begin to ease. The battle had been grueling, and the victory had come at a high cost. The Zorathian fleet had sustained significant damage, and the station itself would need repairs. But despite the heavy losses, the enemy had been defeated, and for that, the Admiral could take solace. Yet, even as his officers congratulated one another, Tyreth found no satisfaction in the victory. His thoughts lingered on the child, Alex, and the strange connection he now felt to the events that had just transpired. The tactics he had ordered to save the station, the sudden, chaotic shifts in formation, the deliberate creation of weaknesses to lure the enemy into a trap, those had come directly from Alex's unpredictable gameplay. The child had instinctively demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that no one had expected. And in turn, that same thinking had saved them all. The more Tyreth reflected on the battle, the more unsettled he became. The enemy had been relentless, intelligent, and unnervingly creative. But what if it wasn't just the enemy they had been fighting? What if, by adapting to their methods, Tyreth had inadvertently demonstrated what humanity was capable of when pushed to the limit? What if Alex's seemingly random decisions in the game weren't random at all, but the result of a much deeper understanding of strategy, one that his species had only just begun to grasp? Tyreth paced the length of the observation room, his mind working furiously. He could no longer deny the implications of what he had witnessed. Humanity was unlike any species he had encountered. They were not bound by the same rigid frameworks of logic and strategy that the Zorathians had built their empire upon. Instead, they operated on a level of creativity and adaptability that transcended anything he had imagined. It was then that a new, terrifying thought struck him. What if humanity's creativity wasn't just a strength? What if it was a weapon? The Zorathians had long prided themselves on their ability to predict and control outcomes. They could plan their strategies, calculate their moves, and crush their opponents with precision. but humanity's unpredictability. This raw, instinctive thinking could never be predicted. It could never be controlled. It was wild, free, and dangerous. And if the humans ever learned to harness it, they could become a force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Tirith stopped pacing and turned toward the large window that overlooked the battle-scarred station. He watched as his fleet began its repairs, officers coordinating with the engineering teams. The threat had passed, but the lingering questions remained. He glanced down at his console, where an incoming communication from the human child, Alex, appeared on the screen. The Admiral raised an eyebrow. It was a direct request from the child, addressed specifically to him. His curiosity piqued. Tirith accepted the message. The child's face appeared on the screen, looking calm as always, his eyes fixed on the Admiral's with a directness that surprised him. "Admiral Tirith," Alex said, his voice steady and clear. "I wanted to thank you for letting me play. I hope I helped." Tirith's heart skipped a beat. The child had no idea what he had truly done, what his games had cost, what they had unlocked. "You did more than help, Alex," Tirith replied, his voice low, contemplative. "You showed me something I didn't understand before. You've helped me understand what humanity is truly capable of." Alex smiled, a simple, innocent grin, as if he had no real comprehension of the gravity of the situation. "I just play to win. But I guess sometimes things work out." Tirith swallowed hard, fighting the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He wasn't sure what to make of this moment. It wasn't the gratitude he had expected. It was something else, something far more profound. The Admiral knew now that Alex wasn't just a child playing a game. The child was a window into the future. And in that future, humanity would be a force to be reckoned with. The communication ended, and Tirith was left standing in the quiet of the room, staring at the screen in a daze. He had just witnessed something far more powerful than any weapon. It wasn't just intelligence that the humans had. It was something deeper, a way of thinking, a creative, adaptive power that could shape the very course of galactic history. He stood there for a long moment, contemplating the strange path ahead. The battle might have been won, but the real war, against the unpredictable genius of humanity, was only just beginning. Days passed, but the weight of the encounter still pressed heavily on Admiral Tirith's mind. The victory against the enemy fleet felt hollow, as if it had come at a cost far greater than the damage done to the station. His thoughts continually circled back to Alex, to the child who had unwittingly revealed the most dangerous thing about humanity, its capacity for creativity and adaptability. Tirith couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of what humanity was truly capable of. What if this was just the beginning? What if, in time, the humans would find ways to use their unconventional strategies not just in simulations, but in the real conflicts that would define the future of the galaxy? The more Tirith considered this, the more he began to realize the implications of his earlier thoughts. If humanity was capable of creating such chaos and brilliance in a game, what would happen if they turned their minds to war? What if their ability to think outside the established boundaries of strategy, what he had initially seen as their weakness, was actually their greatest strength? Tirith knew that his people had relied on their vast resources and superior technology to maintain dominance, but what if humanity could turn the tide in ways that technology couldn't predict or control? The Zorathian Empire prided itself on calculated precision, but if humanity's minds could bend reality the way Alex had bent the simulation, they could undermine every advantage the Empire held. The Admiral's thoughts were interrupted when a high-ranking officer entered the room. His expression was tense, a clear indication that something urgent had occurred. "Admiral," the officer began, standing at attention, "we've received troubling reports. It seems that there are several human fleets making their way toward our outer colonies." Tirith's heart raced. He had expected that humanity might begin to exert itself more in the galaxy, but this was something different. If human fleets were already mobilizing, it could mean that they had not only realized their potential, but were beginning to actively engage with the galaxy on their own terms. "How many ships?" Kyreth asked, his voice steady but his mind already racing with calculations. "Reports vary, sir," the officer replied, "but initial intel suggests that it's a combined force of ships from various human factions. It doesn't appear to be a unified fleet, but rather a coalition. Some are heavily armed, while others are more suited for exploration and trade." Kyreth processed the information quickly. If humanity was uniting their forces, it would be a sign that they were beginning to recognize their strength. They were no longer the fragile, disorganized species the Zorathians had once underestimated. No, humanity was evolving before his very eyes, and it was no longer a question of if they would challenge the Empire. It was a question of when. "Send a message to all fleets. I want every ship on standby," Kyreth ordered, his tone sharp and commanding. "Prepare for potential engagement." As the officer rushed off to relay the orders, Kyreth remained standing by the viewport, staring into the vast expanse of space. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another skirmish, another show of force. No, humanity was no longer playing by the same rules. They were writing their own playbook, one that Kyreth wasn't sure the Empire could match. The Admiral's thoughts turned back to Alex. If the child had only just begun to unlock the strategic genius of his people, what would happen when the full weight of humanity's creativity was unleashed? What kind of war would the Zorathians be fighting if humanity wasn't just reacting to what they saw, but shaping every move to fit their own desires? Kyreth clenched his fists. The stakes had been raised. If humanity truly understood the potential it held, then the galaxy would soon be on the brink of a shift. The Zorathian Empire had survived by controlling the flow of power, by dictating the terms of war. But now, for the first time in millennia, they were facing an enemy that refused to be controlled. A species that could think, adapt, and act in ways no one had expected. There was no turning back now. And Kyreth realized, with a chilling clarity, that humanity wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to change the rules of the entire galaxy. The days following the initial reports were a blur of frantic preparation. Admiral Kyreth and his fleet were on high alert as humanity's forces continued their steady advance toward the Zorathian outer colonies. The tension in the command center was palpable as officers and commanders scrambled to devise new strategies, new ways to respond to this unexpected challenge. Yet, despite the flurry of activity, Kyreth couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something vital. The human fleets weren't behaving as expected. While they appeared to be composed of a hodgepodge of ships, many of them different in size, design, and function, there was a terrifying coherence to their movements. No matter how disparate the ships seemed, they acted with a unified purpose, striking with unanticipated precision. The Zorathian military was built on overwhelming force and calculated dominance, but humanity wasn't playing that game. They weren't playing any game Kyreth had ever seen before. He walked the halls of the flagship in a daze, trying to reconcile the human child he had observed. Alex, with the fleets now headed directly for them. He had seen it in the simulator. Alex's creative thinking, his ability to see things no one else could. But this was no longer a game. The stakes were real, and humanity's unorthodox tactics were now a tangible threat to the Empire's existence. "Admiral." A voice snapped Kyreth from his thoughts. It was his communications officer, looking pale and out of breath. "The human coalition has sent a message. They want to speak with you directly." Kyreth frowned. His first instinct was to prepare for combat, to reject any attempts at negotiation. But something in his gut told him that this wasn't an ordinary diplomatic request. He nodded grimly and motioned for the officer to patch the communication through. The hologram flared to life before him, and Kyreth's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any human officer or diplomat. It was Alex, the same child who had, unknowingly, shattered the Admiral's perception of humanity. His small figure stood before Cyrith, calm and collected, as though he were simply speaking to another player in a simulation. "Admiral Cyrith," Alex said, his voice steady, with none of the panic that Cyrith would have expected from a child in such a situation. "I hope you're well." Cyrith stared at the child, fighting to keep his composure. This was the same Alex who had turned their military strategies on their heads, the same mind that had managed to defeat him in the most unpredictable ways. But now, Alex was here, on a larger stage, representing the forces of humanity. "Alex," Cyrith began, his voice strained. "What is this? Why are you and your people moving against us?" Alex's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. "We're not fighting because we hate you, Admiral. We're fighting because we've learned something. We've learned that we can't keep playing by your rules, your strategies. We've seen how you use force to control everything, and we've realized that the only way to survive, truly survive, is to change the game, to break free from the patterns that everyone else follows." Cyrith felt his stomach tighten. It was the same pattern he had seen in the simulations, the same pattern he had watched unfold during the battle. Humanity wasn't trying to outmuscle them or defeat them through brute force. They were trying to disrupt them, to change the rules of war itself. "We don't want a war," Alex continued, "but we're not going to let anyone keep us down either. This galaxy is big enough for all of us. But it won't work unless we all learn to adapt, to think outside the box, just like you did in that battle." The words hit Cyrith like a hammer. The child, this human child, had just handed him the truth. Humanity's power wasn't in their technology, wasn't in their weapons or fleets. It was in their minds. The ability to adapt, to see beyond what was possible, to fight in ways that no one could predict. It wasn't just a strength. It was a fundamental shift in the way war would be waged. Cyrith's mind raced. The Zorathian Empire, with all its power and might, had never encountered an enemy like this before. Humanity was not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something much more profound. A new way of existence, and if the Zorathians were to survive, they would need to do more than fight. They would need to evolve. "I understand now, Alex," Cyrith said quietly, his tone less commanding and more reflective. Perhaps there is more to humanity than I ever realized." Alex smiled softly, as though hearing the truth for the first time. "I think you're starting to get it." And with that, the transmission ended, leaving Cyrith alone with his thoughts. In that moment, he knew that the galaxy was about to change. Humanity wasn't just a new player on the field. They were the revolution the galaxy never saw coming. And whether they were allies or enemies, the Zorathian Empire could no longer afford to underestimate them. The future was unfolding, and Cyrith couldn't help but wonder if the real battle had only just begun.